The desert sun hammered Fort Briggs like a relentless fist, turning the concrete tarmac into a shimmering furnace. Rachel Torres wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her grease-stained hand, leaving another dark smudge across her already dirt-streaked face. To everyone on base, she was just another civilian contractor, a quiet mechanic who kept her head down and her mouth shut. But Rachel had secrets buried deeper than the classified files locked away in the Pentagon's basement. She moved through the hangar like a ghost, her weather boots making barely a sound on the oil-stained concrete. Her hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, revealing only the smallest hint of black ink at the base of her neck, a mark she kept carefully hidden beneath her collar. The other mechanics barely acknowledged her existence, treating her like part of the equipment rather than a person. "Hey, Torres," barked Sergeant Kevin Walsh, the head of maintenance operations. His voice echoed off the hangar walls, causing several junior technicians to look up from their work. "Those hydraulic lines on Apache 7-2 better be perfect, or you'll be pulling double shifts until Christmas." Rachel didn't flinch. She'd heard worse threats from men far more dangerous than Walsh. "They'll hold," she said simply, not bothering to look up from the rotor assembly she was inspecting with surgical precision. Walsh stepped closer, his breath reeking of stale coffee and cigarettes. "You know what your problem is, Torres? You think you're hot stuff because you can turn a wrench. But you're just another grease monkey who got lucky with a defense contract. Don't forget your place." The other mechanics exchanged glances, some looking uncomfortable with Walsh's tone. But none of them spoke up. They never did. Rachel's hands never stopped moving, checking bolts with the kind of precision that came from years of experience that didn't match her official file. "My place is keeping these birds in the air," she said quietly. "That's what I'm paid to do." "That's all you're paid to do," Walsh shot back. "I don't want to see you anywhere near the flight operations building, understand? Mechanics stay in the hangar. Pilots fly the birds. That's how it's always been, and that's how it's going to stay." As Walsh stormed off, muttering under his breath about contractors who don't know their place, Rachel felt the familiar weight of frustration settle in her chest. She'd been at Fort Briggs for 8 months now, watching mediocre pilots struggle with maneuvers that should have been second nature, seeing maintenance issues that could have been prevented with proper pre-flight procedures. But she stayed quiet. She had to. Later that evening, after the hangar had emptied and the base had settled into its nighttime routine, Rachel remained behind. This was when she did her real work, the kind of thorough maintenance that went beyond what the manual required. She knew these Apaches better than anyone on base, understood their quirks and personalities like old friends. As she worked beneath the belly of Apache 7-2, replacing a hydraulic coupling that wouldn't have failed for another 100 flight hours, but might have caused problems in combat conditions, she heard footsteps approaching. "Working late again, I see." Rachel slid out from under the aircraft to find Captain Diana Ross standing nearby. Unlike most of the officers on base, Ross had always treated her with basic respect, a rarity in a place where civilian contractors were viewed as second-class citizens. "Someone has to," Rachel replied, wiping her hands on a rag. "This bird's been vibrating wrong for 3 days. Walsh keeps saying it's within acceptable parameters." Ross frowned. "But you don't think it is?" Rachel shook her head. "The main rotor assembly is developing stress fractures. Nothing that'll show up on a standard inspection, but in 6 months, ... she shrugged. "Let's just say I wouldn't want to be the pilot taking her out for combat maneuvers." "You seem to know a lot about flight operations for a mechanic," Ross observed, her tone curious rather than accusatory. For a moment, Rachel's carefully constructed facade almost slipped. Her hand unconsciously moved toward her neck, where the hidden tattoo seemed to burn against her skin. "I pay attention," she said finally. "These machines, They deserve better than half measures. Ross studied her for a long moment, as if seeing something that others had missed. Have you ever considered flight school? With your mechanical knowledge, you'd probably make an excellent pilot. Rachel's laugh was bitter. People like me don't get to fly Apaches, Captain. We just keep them running for people who do. As Ross walked away, Rachel returned to her work, unaware that someone else had been listening from the shadows. Someone who recognized the way she moved around the aircraft, the casual familiarity with systems that most mechanics never fully understood. Someone who was beginning to suspect that Rachel Torres wasn't who she claimed to be. The next morning would bring new challenges, new humiliations, and the first step toward a confrontation that would change everything at Fort Briggs. But for now, Rachel worked alone in the darkness, her hands steady and sure, keeping the warriors. Birds ready for battles, she was forbidden to fight. The tattoo on her neck remained hidden, but not for much longer. The alarm blared across Fort Briggs at 0600 hours, jolting Rachel from the light sleep she'd managed to catch in the break room. Emergency scramble, all hands to stations. She was on her feet before the echo faded, muscle memory from another life taking over. In the hangar, chaos reigned. Pilots rushed toward their assigned aircraft while ground crews scrambled to complete pre-flight checks. Rachel moved with practiced efficiency, but her heart sank as she saw Captain Bradley Jensen barking orders near. Apache 7-2, the same bird she'd been warning about for days. Torres. Jensen's voice cut through the noise like a whip crack. This bird better be ready to fly, or I'll have your contract terminated before lunch. Jensen was everything Rachel despised about the modern military, all attitude and politics, with just enough competence to avoid getting people killed. He wore his pilot wings like a crown and treated anyone without them as peasants in his kingdom. Sir, I need 2 minutes to check the rotor assembly, Rachel called out, already moving toward the aircraft. I've been tracking some unusual vibrations that I didn't ask for a technical briefing from the help. Jensen snapped, stepping into her path. I asked if my bird is ready, yes or no. Rachel felt every eye in the hangar on her. The other mechanics had stopped their work, sensing the tension. Some looked sympathetic, others merely uncomfortable. None would risk their jobs by speaking up. The bird will fly, Rachel said carefully, but I strongly recommend. Strongly recommend what? Jensen's voice rose, carrying to every corner of the hangar. Are you trying to tell a decorated combat pilot how to do his job? Maybe you've forgotten your place here, Torres. The words hit like physical blows. Rachel had faced enemy fire, had saved lives and taken them, had earned respect in places where it mattered more than rank or privilege. But here, she was nothing more than a civilian contractor who'd stepped out of line. No, sir, she said quietly. You were just doing exactly what Walsh told you not to do, Jensen interrupted. Sticking your nose where it doesn't belong. Maybe a few days suspension will help you remember the difference between a mechanic and a pilot. Murmurs rippled through the assembled crew. Suspension meant lost pay, and for a contractor, it could mean the end of employment. Rachel felt the familiar rage building in her chest, the same fury that had once made her legendary in combat zones where her real name was whispered with reverence and fear. But she forced it down. She had to. I understand, sir, she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Jensen smiled, clearly enjoying his moment of dominance. Good. Now get out of my hangar before I decide to make this permanent. As Rachel gathered her tools, trying to ignore the pitying looks from her fellow mechanics, she heard Jensen's voice booming across the hangar. Let this be a lesson to everyone. We have a chain of command here, and civilian contractors are at the bottom of it. Pilots fly, mechanics fix, and everyone stays in their lane. But as Rachel walked toward the exit, she felt a presence beside her. Captain Ross had appeared, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes flashing with anger. "This is wrong," Ross said quietly, just loud enough for Rachel to hear. "That bird has issues. I can see it in the way she sits." Rachel glanced back at Apache 7-2, where Jensen was now conducting his own pre-flight inspection with the arrogant confidence of someone who'd never had to pay for his mistakes. "He'll figure it out," she said flatly. "Or he won't. And if he doesn't..." Rachel's hand drifted unconsciously to her neck, where the hidden tattoo seemed to pulse with memories of missions where failure meant death. "Then we'll see what kind of pilot he really is." As she left the hangar, Rachel heard the distinctive whine of Apache engines spinning up. Through the open doors, she watched Jensen's bird lift off, joining two others in formation as they headed toward the training range. Everything looked normal to the untrained eye. But Rachel saw the subtle wrongness in the rotor disc, the slight hesitation in the climb rate. Apache 7-2 was a ticking time bomb, and Jensen was too arrogant to see it. She was halfway to her quarters when her phone buzzed. "Captain Ross. They're 20 minutes out from the range," the text read. "Something's wrong with 7-2. Jensen's reporting control issues." Rachel stared at the message, feeling the weight of terrible certainty settle over her. She tried to warn them. She'd followed protocol, respected the chain of command, played by their rules. And now a pilot was about to pay the price for their arrogance. She looked up at the sky, watching the distant specks of the Apache formation disappear over the horizon. In another life, she would have been up there with them, not as a passenger, but as the kind of pilot that legends were built around. But that life was supposed to be dead and buried. The woman who had once struck fear into the hearts of enemies and inspired unwavering loyalty in her comrades was officially a ghost. The question was, how long could she let that ghost stay buried while good people died? Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was an emergency frequency, the kind used when training exercises became real emergencies. "Mayday, mayday. Apache 7-2. Experiencing complete hydraulic failure. Auto-rotation unsuccessful. Going down hard." Rachel closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of command responsibility settling on her shoulders. Jensen was about to learn the difference between a pilot and a warrior. And Fort Briggs was about to discover that some ghosts refused to stay dead. The crash site was a scar of twisted metal and scorched earth, visible even from the base perimeter. Black smoke rose in a thin column against the desert sky, and the smell of burning fuel and electronics carried on the wind. Rachel Torres stood at the hangar's edge, watching the emergency vehicles race toward the impact zone, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Captain Bradley Jensen was alive barely. The initial radio reports confirmed he'd survived the crash, but with severe injuries and third-degree burns across 40% of his body. The Apache he'd refused to listen to concerns about was now a $30 million pile of wreckage scattered across a quarter-mile of desert floor. "Torres!" Sergeant Walsh's voice cracked like a whip behind her. She turned to find him approaching with two MPs flanking him, their expressions grim. "You're confined to quarters pending investigation." "Investigation into what?" Rachel asked. Though she already knew the answer. Someone needed a scapegoat, and the civilian contractor who'd warned about mechanical issues was the perfect target. "Sabotage," Walsh said, clearly savoring the word. "Funny how the bird you were working on just happened to suffer catastrophic failure, isn't it?" Rachel felt something cold and deadly settle in her chest, the same calm that had once made her untouchable in combat zones where lesser pilots cracked under pressure. "You want to accuse me of sabotage? Fine, but you'll do it with evidence, not paranoia." One of the MPs stepped forward. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us." As they escorted her across the base, Rachel caught sight of Captain Ross watching from the flight operations building. Their eyes met for a moment, and Ross gave the slightest nod, a gesture of support that meant more than she could know. The interrogation room was a sterile box with fluorescent lights that hummed like angry insects. For 3 hours, Rachel sat across from Major David Palmer, the base's criminal investigation officer, answering the same questions over and over. "You had access to Apache 7-2 for the past week," Palmer said, consulting his notes. "Multiple witnesses heard you arguing with Captain Jensen about the aircraft's condition." "I was trying to prevent exactly what happened," Rachel replied for the dozenth time. "The hydraulic lines were showing stress fractures. I documented it in my maintenance reports. Reports that conveniently support your cover story," Palmer shot back. "Here's what I think happened. You got angry about being put in your place. Decided to teach the hotshot pilot a lesson. Maybe you didn't mean for it to go this far, but what?" Rachel's voice remained steady, but something in her eyes made Palmer pause. "You think I'd risk a pilot's life over hurt feelings? You think I'd destroy a multi-million-dollar aircraft because someone was rude to me?" Palmer leaned back, studying her face. "I think you're not who you say you are. Your background is thin, Torres. Too thin. No military service, but you know. These birds better than mechanics with 20 years experience. You move wrong, talk wrong, think wrong for a simple contractor." Rachel said nothing, but her hand unconsciously moved toward her neck, where the hidden tattoo seemed to burn beneath her collar. Palmer noticed the gesture, his eyes narrowing. "Why don't you tell me who you really are?" he said quietly. "Maybe we can work something out." Before Rachel could respond, the door burst open. Colonel James Harrison strode in, his weathered face thunderous with rage. Behind him came Captain Ross, and a man Rachel didn't recognize, a civilian in an expensive suit who radiated the kind of quiet authority that came from alphabet agencies. "This interrogation is over," Harrison announced. "Palmer, get out." "Sir, you're in the middle of making this base look like a collection of incompetent amateurs," Harrison snapped. "The preliminary crash report just came in. Hydraulic failure caused by metal fatigue in exactly the location Torres identified in her maintenance logs. Logs that were ignored by your boy Jensen." Palmer's face went white. "But sir, the timing. The timing proves she was the only person on this base doing her job properly," Harrison said. "Now get out before I have you brought up on charges for conducting an unauthorized interrogation of a witness." As Palmer shuffled out, defeated and humiliated, Harrison turned to Rachel. His eyes were sharp, calculating the look of a man who'd spent decades reading people and situations. "Miss Torres," he said quietly. "Or should I say, Captain Torres." The words hung in the air like an unexploded bomb. Rachel felt her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble, but her expression remained neutral. "I don't know what you mean, sir." The civilian in the suit stepped forward, opening a tablet and showing her a photograph grainy, taken from a distance, but unmistakably her in full flight gear standing beside an Apache with unfamiliar markings. "Kandahar Province, 2019, he said quietly. "Operation Ghostwatch. The pilot they called Raven 6 saved an entire forward operating base from being overrun. Officially, that pilot never existed. Unofficially, ... He paused, studying her face. "Well, let's just say certain people in Washington have been very interested in finding out what happened to one of their most decorated black ops pilots." Rachel's world tilted. For 5 years, she'd lived in the shadows, hiding from a past that officially never existed. She'd taken a new name, a new identity, content to serve in silence while trying to forget the blood on her hands and the friends she'd left behind. But secrets had a way of surfacing, especially when incompetent officers nearly got people killed. "I don't fly anymore," she said quietly. "No," Colonel Harrison agreed. "You just keep birds in the air for pilots who don't deserve to touch their controls. Tell me, Captain, and yes, you're still Captain Torres in the system that matters. How long were you planning to let mediocrity rule this base?" Rachel looked at each of them in turn. Harrison, whose eyes held a mixture of respect and curiosity. Ross, who was staring at her with dawning understanding. The civilian, who represented a world she tried to leave behind. "I was trying to build a different life," she said finally. "And how's that working out?" Harrison asked. "Because from where I stand, you just watched a good pilot nearly die because lesser men were too proud to listen to someone they saw as beneath them." The truth of it hit like a physical blow. Rachel had spent months watching incompetence parade as authority, had bitten her tongue while pilots made mistakes that would have gotten them killed in real combat. She told herself she was protecting her secret, building a normal life. But there was nothing normal about watching people die when you had the skills to prevent it. "What do you want from me?" she asked. Harrison smiled, the predatory grin of a commander who just gained a decisive advantage. "I want you to stop pretending to be something you're not. This base needs pilots, real ones. And more than that, it needs someone who can teach these kids the difference between flying and surviving. And if I say no?" The civilian closed his tablet. "Then you go back to your quarters, finish out your contract, and disappear again. But Captain Jensen's career is over, and he was one of our better pilots. The next crash might not have any survivors." Rachel closed her eyes, feeling the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. She'd tried to escape the warrior she'd once been, but some battles couldn't be fought from the shadows. When she opened her eyes again, something had changed. The careful blankness was gone, replaced by the steady confidence of someone who'd faced death and emerged victorious. "I'll need access to personnel files," she said quietly, "and authority to restructure the training program." Harrison's grin widened. "Consider it done." As they left the interrogation room, Rachel felt the ghost of her former self stirring to life. The woman who'd once been legend was about to remind Fort Briggs what real warriors looked like. But first, she had to face the hardest part, revealing the truth about who she really was. The personnel files made for grim reading. Rachel sat in Colonel Harrison's office at 0200 hours, spreading folders across his desk like a battlefield. "Commander, planning an assault." The base's pilot roster read like a catalog of mediocrity. Adequate flight times, passing grades on written exams, but nothing that suggested the kind of instinctive skill needed when training became reality. 47 active pilots, she murmured, running a finger down the list. And maybe 6 of them I'd trust in actual combat. Harrison looked up from his coffee. "That's a generous assessment. I was thinking 4. Outside the office windows, Fort Briggs slept under a blanket of desert stars. In 12 hours, Rachel would walk into the flight operations building as an officially reinstated officer. Her civilian contractor days were over, but the transition felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. "You know, this changes everything," she said quietly. "Once word gets out about who I really am, there'll be questions. People will want to know where I've been, what I've been doing." "Let me worry about the politics," Harrison replied. "Your job is to turn my mediocre pilots into something resembling warriors before they get themselves killed." Rachel picked up another file. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, 26 years old, graduated flight school with honors, perfect safety record. On paper, he looked impressive. But she'd watched him fly, seen the hesitation in his movements, the textbook precision. That would crumble under real pressure. "They're soft," she said finally. "All of them. They've never had to face a situation where following the manual gets people killed." Harrison nodded grimly. "That's what happens when you fight wars with drones and technology instead of warriors." These kids think piloting is about checklists and procedures. A knock at the door interrupted them. Captain Ross entered, carrying 2 steaming mugs and looking like she hadn't slept in days. "Thought you might need caffeine," she said, setting the mugs down. Then, hesitating, "Jensen's stable. Doctors say he'll live, but his flying days are over." Rachel felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. Another pilot down. Another career ended because incompetence had been allowed to masquerade as leadership. "Captain Ross," Harrison said. "Meet Captain Rachel Torres. Recently reinstated to active duty." Ross's eyes widened. The contractor was a cover identity, Rachel said quietly. "Sometimes the best way to observe is from the shadows." "My God," Ross breathed. "All those times you tried to warn us about maintenance issues, about flight procedures. You weren't just a mechanic with good instincts." "No," Rachel agreed. "I was a pilot watching other pilots make mistakes I knew would get them killed." The weight of that revelation hung in the air. Ross sank into a chair, processing the implications. "So what happens now?" she asked. Harrison leaned forward. "Now we find out if this base is ready to learn from someone who's actually fought. The kind of war they might face someday." Rachel stood, walking to the window that overlooked the flight line. Rows of Apaches sat in the darkness like sleeping predators, waiting for dawn and another day of training exercises that bore little resemblance to real combat. "I'll need full authority over flight training," she said without turning around. "No interference from department heads, no politics from officers who think rank trumps experience." "Done," Harrison said immediately. "And I'll need to restructure the entire program. What they're teaching these pilots now is going to get them killed the first time they face real opposition. Whatever you need." Rachel turned back to face them, and both Harrison and Ross saw something that hadn't been there before. The cold confidence of someone who'd survived countless battles by being better than everyone trying to kill her. "There's something else," she said quietly. "My methods aren't going to be popular. I don't believe in gentle instruction or protecting egos. Warriors are forged in fire, not coddled in classrooms." Ross shifted uncomfortably. "These pilots have families, lives outside the military. They're not special operations candidates. Every pilot who climbs into a combat aircraft is a potential special operations candidate," Rachel countered. "The enemy doesn't care about their families or their feelings. When the shooting starts, they'll either be warriors or casualties." Harrison smiled grimly. "Good. This base has been soft for too long. Maybe it's time to remember what we're training for." As the meeting broke up and Ross departed, Harrison lingered behind with Rachel. "There's something you should know," he said quietly. "Your old unit, the 109th Aviation Regiment. They're being reactivated." Rachel's blood turned to ice. The 109th had been disbanded after Operation Ghostwatch, its survivors scattered to the winds or buried in unmarked graves. If they were bringing it back, why? She asked. "Because certain intelligence agencies believe we're going to need pilots who can operate behind enemy lines with no support and minimal resources. Pilots who can improvise, adapt, and survive when everything goes wrong." Rachel closed her eyes, seeing faces of friends long dead, remembering missions that officially never happened. "They want the Ghost Unit back." "They want you back," Harrison corrected. "This training assignment? It's an audition. They're watching to see if Captain Rachel Torres still has what made Raven 6 legendary." The revelation hit like a punch to the gut. She'd thought she was escaping her past by hiding at Fort Briggs, but she'd actually been maneuvered into position for exactly this moment. "And if I refuse?" Harrison's expression grew somber. "Then, good pilots will continue dying because they were never taught how to survive. And somewhere out there, enemies of this country will continue believing that American pilots are soft, predictable, and easy to kill. Rachel stared out at the flight line again, feeling the weight of destiny settling around her like familiar armor. She tried to leave the warrior behind, but the warrior had never left her. "When do I start?" she asked. 0800 hours. "I've called a mandatory assembly for all pilots. You'll introduce yourself and outline the new training protocols." As Rachel left the office, she felt the last vestiges of her civilian contractor identity falling away like shed skin. Tomorrow, Fort Briggs would meet the woman who'd once been whispered about in enemy camps, the ghost pilot who struck without warning and vanished into the night. But first, she had to decide how much of the truth she was ready to reveal. Because once the warriors came out of hiding, there was no going back to the shadows. The base slept on, unaware that everything was about to change. The flight operations building had never been so quiet. Every pilot at Fort Briggs sat in rigid attention. As Colonel Harrison took the podium, his expression grave. Behind him, Rachel Torres stood with her hands clasped behind her back, her posture radiating the kind of controlled power that made even seasoned officers uneasy. She was no longer dressed in greasy coveralls. The crisp army uniform bore captains, bars, and pilot wings, but it was her eyes that commanded attention, cold, calculating, and utterly without mercy for weakness. "Gentlemen and ladies," Harrison began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Recent events have made it clear that this base's training standards are inadequate. Captain Jensen's crash could have been prevented if certain warnings had been heeded. It's time for changes." Murmurs rippled through the assembled pilots. Lieutenant Webb raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, are you suggesting that Jensen's crash was pilot error?" Harrison's smile was predatory. "I'm not suggesting anything, Lieutenant. I'm stating facts. The aircraft suffered hydraulic failure in exactly the location identified in maintenance reports that were ignored due to pilot arrogance." The murmurs grew louder, tinged with anger and defensiveness. These men and women had trained together, flown together, built their identities around being elite aviators. The suggestion that one of their own had caused his own crash was tantamount to heresy. "Now," Harrison continued, "I'd like you to meet your new training commander. Captain Rachel Torres will be restructuring our flight program to bring it in line with actual combat requirements." Rachel stepped forward, her movement precise and economical. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Good morning," she said simply. "Over the next few weeks, you're going to learn the difference between flying and surviving. Some of you will adapt, others won't. Those who can't will be transferred to transport duties or grounded permanently." Lieutenant Webb spoke up again, his voice challenging. "Ma'am, with respect, your file shows no combat experience. Most of us have deployment time. My file shows exactly what it needs to show," Rachel interrupted, her tone cutting through his protest like a blade. "But since you're curious about experience, let me ask you something, Lieutenant. How many times have you been shot down?" Webb blinked, clearly thrown by the question. "Shot down? Ma'am, I've never been in actual combat. How many times have you had to land a damaged aircraft with enemy fire incoming?" "I none, ma'am." "How many times have you extracted troops from a hot LZ with no backup, no air support, and fuel, for maybe 10 minutes of flight time?" The room had gone completely silent. Webb's face was flushing red, but he couldn't seem to find words. "None," Rachel answered for him. "Which means your deployment time consisted of flying in circles over friendly territory, following GPS waypoints and landing at secure bases with hot meals waiting." She turned to address the entire room. "Every one of you thinks you're a combat pilot. You wear the uniform, carry the wings, talk the talk. But not one of you has ever been tested under the conditions you'll face if this country goes to war with a real enemy. Captain Sandra Martinez, one of the more senior pilots, stood up. Ma'am, I flew over 60 missions in Afghanistan against an enemy with no air force, no advanced surface-to-air missiles, and no electronic warfare capabilities. Rachel cut her off. You flew in permissive environments with overwhelming support. That's not combat flying. That's airborne taxi service. The room erupted. Pilots jumped to their feet, voices raised in anger and protest. These were proud men and women who'd dedicated their lives to military aviation, and they weren't about to let some mysterious captain tear down everything they'd built their identities around. Harrison let the chaos continue for exactly 30 seconds, then slammed his hand on the podium. Quiet. The noise died instantly. In the sudden silence, Rachel's voice carried with absolute clarity. Lieutenant Webb, she said, her tone conversational. You mentioned your perfect safety record. Tell me, what's your emergency procedure if you lose hydraulics at 50 feet at GL in a hover? Webb straightened, relieved to be on familiar ground. Ma'am, immediate landing. Execute emergency checklist. Maintain. Wrong, Rachel said flatly. You just killed everyone you were trying to save. Captain Martinez, same scenario. What's your response? Martinez frowned, clearly thinking through. The textbook answer. Emergency auto-rotation, find suitable LZ, also wrong. Both of you just crashed and burned because you're thinking like students, not survivors. She walked to the front of the room, her movement predatory. The correct answer is, it depends. Depends on terrain, enemy activity, mission priority, available alternatives, and a dozen other factors that no textbook can teach you. Real combat flying isn't about following procedures. It's about making split-second decisions with incomplete information while people are trying to kill you. Rachel paused, letting that sink in. Over the next month, you're going to learn what that feels like. We'll start with basic survival scenarios and work up to combat maneuvers that will push you beyond anything you've experienced. Some of you will discover you have what it takes to be warriors. Others will learn they're better suited for other roles. The room was electric with tension. Some pilots looked intrigued, others angry, a few genuinely frightened. Ma'am, Lieutenant, Sarah Brooks called out, what qualifies you to make these assessments? Your record shows civilian contractor status until yesterday. Rachel smiled a cold expression that never reached her eyes. She walked over to the flight status board and picked up a marker, writing a single call sign in bold letters, Raven 6. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Several pilots gasped audibly. Captain Martinez went pale. Lieutenant Webb's mouth fell open. Holy shit, someone whispered. Colonel Harrison stepped forward. Ladies and gentlemen, meet the pilot who single-handedly held off a reinforced enemy battalion for 47 minutes. While extracting 3 downed aircrews. The pilot who flew 17 consecutive combat missions behind enemy lines with 0 losses. The pilot who officially doesn't exist because her missions were too classified for the history books. The silence in the room was deafening. Every military aviator had heard whispers of Raven 6, the ghost pilot who appeared when situations were hopeless and disappeared when the job was done. Rachel capped the marker and turned back to face them. Now, she said quietly, who wants to learn how to really fly? The transformation had begun. Fort Briggs was about to discover what happened when legends stepped out of the shadows to forge the next generation of warriors. But first, they had to survive the training. The Apache Simulator Bay at 0500 hours was a cathedral of electronic warfare. Banks of monitors casting blue light across the faces of 12 pilots who'd thought they knew what pressure felt like. Rachel Torres moved between the pods like a hunting predator, her voice cutting through the artificial chaos of simulated combat. Martinez, you're dead. Webb, you just killed your wingman. Brooks, you're flying like a drunk tourist. 3 weeks. Into the new training regime, Fort Briggs had become a different kind of base. Gone were the relaxed briefings and predictable flight patterns. In their place was a crucible that separated warriors from wannabes with ruthless efficiency. Captain. Sandra Martinez struggled out of her simulator pod, sweat-soaked and shaking. Ma'am, that scenario was impossible. Surface-to-air missiles, enemy fighters, and mechanical failure all at once. Welcome to reality, Rachel replied without sympathy. In Helmand Province, I dealt with exactly that situation while extracting a SEAL team. The difference is, when I failed, people died. When you fail here, you just try again. Lieutenant Webb raised his hand from his pod. Ma'am, request clarification on the enemy fighter engagement. My manual says, your manual was written by people who never had to dodge missiles while flying nap of the earth through mountain valleys. Rachel cut him off. Forget the manual. Start thinking. The training regime was unlike anything the pilots had experienced. Traditional scenarios had been replaced with nightmarish combinations of equipment failures, hostile fire, and impossible mission parameters. Sleep was a luxury, comfort was non-existent, and failure was a constant companion. But something was happening. The pilots who'd initially been the most vocal opponents of Rachel's methods were beginning to show signs of adaptation. Their reflexes were sharpening, their decision-making improving, their coordination becoming more intuitive. Lieutenant Sarah Brooks, who'd openly questioned Rachel's qualifications 3 weeks earlier, was now regularly scoring in the top tier of combat scenarios. Her technique was still rough, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before, the kind of focused intensity that separated survivors from casualties. Brooks, Rachel called as the morning session ended. A word. The young pilot approached warily. Over the past weeks, individual conversations with Captain Torres had become legendary. Sometimes they ended with pilots walking taller. Sometimes they ended with transfer requests. You're starting to think like a combat pilot, Rachel said. Without preamble. Your instincts are improving, but you're still hesitating at critical moments. Brooks nodded, accepting the criticism. The defiance that had characterized her early interactions with Rachel had been replaced by genuine respect earned through competence demonstrated under fire. Ma'am, it's the scenarios where civilians are involved. I keep thinking about collateral damage, and that hesitation will get those civilians killed along with your crew, Rachel interrupted. In real combat, sometimes the choice isn't between saving everyone and saving no one. Sometimes it's between losing a few and losing all of them. It was a harsh lesson, but Brooks was beginning to understand. The neat moral certainties taught in flight school dissolved quickly when faced with the brutal mathematics of life and death decisions. There's something else, Rachel continued, lowering her voice. I'm recommending you for advanced tactical training, if you're interested. Brooks's eyes widened. Advanced tactical training meant special operations, the kind of flying that officially didn't exist. Ma'am, yes. Absolutely yes, Rachel nodded. Report to Hangar 7 at 2,200 hours. Come alone, and don't mention this conversation to anyone. As Brooks left, excitement and nervousness warring in her expression, Rachel turned to find Colonel Harrison watching from the observation deck. His expression was unreadable, but she could see approval in his eyes. The real test, however, was about to begin. The emergency klaxon shattered the pre-dawn quiet at Fort Briggs like the scream of wounded metal. Rachel Torres was moving before the echo faded, muscle memory from 100 real crises taking over as she sprinted toward the operations center. This wasn't a drill, the tone was wrong, the urgency too genuine. Colonel Harrison met her at the door, his face grim in the red emergency lighting. We've got a situation. Search and rescue team went down 40 minutes ago in the Sangre Mountains. Mechanical failure, possibly hostile activity. Rachel's blood chilled. The Sangre Mountains were a notorious dead zone, narrow canyons, unpredictable weather, and enough radio interference to turn any rescue attempt into a blind grope through hostile terrain. "What assets do we have available?" she asked, already running through contingencies. 2 Apaches prepped for search patterns. Problem is, every qualified pilot is either grounded with the flu or lacks the mountain experience for this kind of operation. Rachel studied the tactical display, seeing the search grid overlaid on topographical maps that looked like a maze of death traps. The missing crew had exactly 4 hours of survival time in the current weather conditions, assuming they'd survived the crash at all. "Sir, I need to take lead on this." Harrison hesitated. "Torres, you've been training other pilots for weeks, but you haven't been in the cockpit yourself." "Are you sure?" "Colonel, with respect, this is exactly the kind of operation I was born for." Before Harrison could respond, Lieutenant Brooks burst through the door, still pulling on her flight suit. "Sir, I volunteer for search duty." "I know. Those mountains." "Absolutely not," Harrison began, but Rachel held up a hand. "Brooks, what's your experience with high-altitude canyon flying in adverse weather?" "Limited, ma'am, but I learned fast." Rachel studied the younger pilot, seeing something in her eyes that reminded her of her own younger self, the hunger to prove oneself when everything was on the line. "You'll be my wingman," Rachel decided. "But you follow my lead exactly. No improvisation, no heroics." "This isn't training anymore." Harrison started to protest, but the look Rachel gave him silenced any objections. This was no longer a training exercise or administrative decision. This was combat, and in combat, the most qualified pilot led, regardless of politics. 20 minutes later, 2 Apaches lifted off into a sky the color of old blood, their rotors beating against air thick with approaching storm clouds. Rachel felt the familiar rush of adrenaline as the aircraft responded to her touch, the intimate dance between pilot and machine that she'd missed more than she'd admitted. "Raven 6 to control," she transmitted, using her old call sign without thinking, proceeding to search grid Alpha. Weather deteriorating, but still within operational parameters. Brooks's voice crackled through the comm. "Ghost 2 copies. Following your lead." The mountains rose around them like the teeth of some primordial beast, jagged peaks disappearing into low-hanging clouds that could hide 1,000 dangers. Rachel dropped to nap of the Earth altitude, using terrain masking to avoid the worst of the wind shear while following the downed aircraft's last known heading. "There," Brooks called out suddenly. "Smoke signature, bearing 270, approximately 3 clicks." Rachel banked hard left, feeling the Apache respond with the aggressive grace of a predator changing direction. Below them, a thin column of smoke rose from a narrow canyon barely wide enough for their rotor discs. "That's our bird, Rachel," confirmed, seeing the distinctive outline of military wreckage scattered across the canyon floor. "But I'm seeing movement down there. Could be survivors, could be hostiles." The tactical situation was a nightmare. The canyon was too narrow for a standard approach. The weather was deteriorating by the minute, and unknown contacts were moving near the crash site. Everything Rachel had been teaching her pilots about thinking beyond the manual was about to be put to the ultimate test. "Ghost 2, maintain overwatch position. I'm going down for a closer look." "Ma'am, that canyon's barely wide enough." "I know," Rachel said, dropping the Apache into a descent that would have terrified most pilots. "Trust the training." What happened next would become legend at Fort Briggs. Rachel Torres Raven 6 threaded her Apache through a canyon so narrow that the rotor tips nearly kissed the rock walls, executing a hover that put her within 50 feet of the crash site while maintaining enough altitude to escape if necessary. The survivors were definitely military. 3 crew members, one seriously wounded. But they weren't alone. Rachel's thermal imaging picked up 6 contacts moving through the rocks above the crash site, and the way they moved suggested training and hostile intent. Ghost 2, we have company. 6 possible hostiles in overwatch positions. I'm going to need you to provide suppressive fire on my mark. Brooks's voice was steady despite the circumstances. Copy, Raven 6. Standing by. What followed was a textbook example of combat flying that would be studied for years afterward. Rachel coordinated a precision extraction while under fire, using the canyon walls for cover, while Brooks provided overwatch from above. When one of the hostiles fired an RPG that barely missed her tail rotor, Rachel's response was swift and decisive, a burst from her chain gun that sent the entire enemy team scrambling for cover. 18 minutes after entering the canyon, both Apaches were climbing toward safety, with all 3 survivors aboard. The wounded crew member would need immediate medical attention, but everyone was alive. As they approached Fort Briggs, Rachel felt a familiar satisfaction, the knowledge that her skills, her training, her willingness to risk everything had made the difference between life and death for 3 people who deserved to go home to their families. But more importantly, Lieutenant Brooks had performed flawlessly under the kind of pressure that broke lesser pilots. She'd proven that Rachel's training methods weren't just theory, they worked. The medical evacuation helicopter lifted off from Fort Briggs as the sun touched the horizon, carrying the rescued aircrew toward the trauma center in Albuquerque. Rachel Torres stood on the tarmac, still in her flight suit, watching the aircraft disappear into the distance with a satisfaction that ran deeper than simple mission accomplishment. Colonel Harrison approached, his face showing a mixture of relief and something approaching awe. That was some flying, Captain. The kind that reminds people why legends get made. Rachel turned to face him, and for the first time since revealing her identity, she smiled, not the cold expression of command, but something warmer, more human. It wasn't just me, sir. Brooks performed exactly as trained. She's ready for anything now. Behind them, Lieutenant Sarah Brooks was completing her post-flight checklist with the methodical precision of someone who just discovered what she was truly capable of. The scared, uncertain pilot who'd questioned Rachel's methods was gone, replaced by someone who'd looked death in the face and emerged victorious. There's something you should know, Harrison said quietly. During the mission, we monitored your radio traffic. You used your old call sign. Rachel nodded. She'd realized it the moment the words left her mouth. Raven 6. The identity she'd tried so hard to bury, emerging naturally when lives were on the line. Old habits, she said simply. Maybe, Harrison agreed. Or maybe some things are too important to stay buried. Over the following weeks, Fort Briggs transformed completely. Word of the rescue mission spread through the base like wildfire, and with it came a new understanding of what Captain Torres represented. She wasn't just another instructor, she was living proof that excellence was possible, that the difference between mediocrity and greatness was measured in dedication, skill, and the willingness to risk everything for others. The pilot training program that had once produced competent but unremarkable aviators began turning out warriors. Not all of the original pilots made the cut. Several were transferred to other duties, unable to adapt to the new standards. But those who remained emerged transformed. Lieutenant Webb, once arrogant and dismissive, became one of the program's most dedicated students. His perfect safety record was replaced by something more valuable, the kind of tactical awareness that would keep him alive in real combat. Captain Martinez, initially resistant to change, discovered reserves of skill and courage she'd never known she possessed. Her flying became intuitive, aggressive, and absolutely fearless. And Lieutenant Brooks was selected for special operations training, her name added to a list of pilots deemed capable of missions that officially didn't exist. But the most significant change was in Rachel herself. For 5 years, she'd hidden from her true nature, content to work in shadows while her skills atrophied. The rescue mission had reminded her who she really was, not just a pilot, but a warrior whose gifts were too valuable to waste on anonymity. 3 months after revealing her identity, Rachel received new orders. The 109th Aviation Regiment was indeed being reactivated, and they wanted their most legendary pilot to help train the next generation of ghost warriors. As she cleaned out her quarters, preparing for transfer to a base that didn't officially exist, Captain Ross knocked on her door. "I wanted to thank you," Ross said simply. "Before you arrived, we were just going through the motions. Now we're actually ready for whatever comes next." Rachel paused in her packing. "That was never about me. It was about remembering what we're supposed to be." "And what's that?" "Warriors," Rachel said without hesitation. "Not bureaucrats in uniform, not technicians who happen to fly. Warriors who understand that some things are worth fighting for, and some fights can't be won by people who aren't willing to risk everything." Ross nodded, understanding passing between them. "The pilots you trained here, they'll carry that forward. Your legacy won't be the missions you flew. It'll be the warriors you created." The next morning, Rachel Torres Raven 6 climbed into an unmarked helicopter for transport to her new assignment. As Fort Briggs fell away beneath her, she felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with personal achievement and everything to do with purpose fulfilled. Behind her, newly minted warriors prepared for their own missions, carrying skills and knowledge that would save lives in conflicts yet to come. The legend of Raven 6 would continue to grow, but more importantly, the standards she'd established would endure. Some ghosts, Rachel reflected as the helicopter banked toward an uncertain but purposeful future, were meant to haunt the living until they learned to become legends themselves. The quiet mechanic who'd once hidden her true nature was gone forever. In her place stood a warrior who'd remembered the most important lesson of all. Excellence demands everything, but gives back the only thing that truly matters, the knowledge that when it counted most, you were worthy of the trust placed in you. At Fort Briggs, training would never be the same. And in the shadowy world of special operations, Raven 6 had returned to forge the next generation of pilots who would strike from darkness and vanish into legend. The cycle was complete, but the legacy would endure forever. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Have you ever been underestimated because of your appearance or position? Share your story in the comments. You never know who might be inspired by your journey from the shadows to recognition.